Welcome to social psychology again, and today we will be talking about two important issues of social psychology: leadership and decision making. Vorher möchte ich Sie aber nochmal gerne aufmerksam machen, an unserer Studie teilzunehmen, diese IAT-Studie. Sie bekommen dann nach Weihnachten auch die Versuchspersonenminuten gut geschrieben und wir arbeiten gerade am Design der Studie, an der Sie nur teilnehmen können, wenn Sie hier auch mitgemacht haben. Und insbesondere nicht die Schülerinnen und Schüler, die heute hier sind, aber die Sozialpsychologen unter Ihnen. Das ist wirklich auch interessant, mal so ein IAT von Anfang bis Ende durchzumachen. Wenn man das einmal gemacht hat, weiß man auch viel mehr, worüber der Mensch da vorne im Hörsaal immer spricht, wenn er von impliziten Maßen und impliziten Einstellungstests spricht. Also bitte nehmen Sie teil, das ist auch auf Psyconnect eingestellt. Sie brauchen sich also jetzt nicht den langen Link runterladen, also auf Psyconnect unter Ausschreibungen Versuchspersonen finden Sie den Test unter Implicit Follower Theories. Let's briefly talk about the multiple choice items of last week's topic. We talked about the research by Mustafa Sharif, one of the founders of social psychology, the groundbreaking studies. And in his realistic group conflict theory, he argued that simple contact between members of opposing groups can improve intergroup relations. The mere presence of another group should improve intergroup relations. Shared goals between groups reduce intergroup conflict. Or superordinate goals take group conflict to a higher level. C, correct. So remember, Sharif first brought the boys together, then divided them into two groups, eagles and rattlers, and then he introduced conflict by having them compete for scarce material resources. And he found that the groups relatively quickly became hostile, unfriendly, biased, prejudiced against each other. And this could be resolved, at least to some extent, by introducing shared goals in the third phase of the experiment. An aspect of yourself arises from group memberships. It is your social identity, affiliation motive, sense of belongingness, or your personal identity. Social identity. This is the key of social identity theory. Our self-esteem derives from two main aspects of ourselves: our personal identity, who we are as individuals, and from our group memberships, our social identity. Okay, any questions? Yeah, bitte. Yeah, maybe you are correct. I mean, sense of belongingness is something that we all have. We all have a motive for affiliation. We all have a motive for belonging to others. We will talk about this in the lecture on affiliation, attraction, and love. But whether this sense stems from our group memberships, I'm not sure, or whether this sense or motive of belongingness leads us to affiliate with groups and makes us becoming part of more groups. I'm not sure, but you are right, it's a little bit ambiguous. Okay, leadership and decision making, two very important topics. Here are some items. And I would like you to discuss this focus question for a moment. Jane is a fearsome and energetic office manager who bustles around issuing orders. She expects and gets prompt action from her employees when she is around. How hard do you think her employees work when she is out of the office? Discuss with the people next to you for 1 or 2 minutes, please, and I will give you an answer during the course of this lecture. Okay, thank you very much. Who of you thinks that her employees will work just as hard as when she is around? So no big change whether she's in the office or out of the office. Who thinks that their employees will work less hard? Okay, thank you. Maybe you have read the slides, or maybe you, I don't know. You're just good, naive psychologists. So we will talk about leadership today and about decision making. We will talk about the various theoretical approaches to leadership, and then we will focus on factors that affect the quality of decision making in groups, particularly groupthink and group polarization. More specifically, we talk about the great person theory, leadership behaviors, feedless contingency theory, and then a little bit about leadership as a group process. And when we talk about decision making, we will look at decision making rules, brainstorming, group memory, group think, and group polarization. Now, how can we first define leadership? And if I would ask you who is a good leader, who was a good leader, then you may think about good people. Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi. Many people may come into your mind that have been shown to be good leaders, outstanding leaders. But you may also think about very negative examples, dictators, such as Hitler, for example, or stupid leaders who still have achieved and accomplished goals. In social psychological terms, the leader of a group is the person who has the most impact on group behavior and beliefs. So it doesn't matter whether the leader's actions serve a good or a bad cause, whether the leader is a nice person, an outstanding leader such as Gandhi or other people, or whether they serve really, really bad causes such as the dictators we all know. And for some people, it's also not so easy to say. Think for example, about Martin Luther King. Was he a great leader? Who thinks Martin Luther King was a good leader? Yeah, a few. And if I would show you the classic "I have a dream" speech, maybe more hands would rise. But do you know that Martin Luther King cheated on his wife? And this was a really bad thing in the black community in the 1950s and 60s, particularly for a religious leader like Martin Luther King. Did you know that Martin Luther King cheated on his PhD, on his dissertation? So he was a modern, or he was a traditional type of zu Gutenberg or Chavan, which is also not a good thing. So it must not necessarily be the case that a person who might have good leadership qualities in one domain are good people in every other domain of life. Leaders may be appointed, elected, or emerge over time. And the first theory that we were looking at is the great person theory of leadership. This suggests that leaders possess particular characteristics. And the first maybe 30 years of the past century, from 1900 to 1930, 35, were focused on finding the characteristics that make people good leaders. And this research either looked at people who have made it into leadership positions and compared those to people who were not in leadership positions, or compared leaders who were in leadership positions and compared those who were more successful in terms of profit, leading the number of people, etc., compared to those who were in leadership positions but less effective. And several factors or characteristics have been found: strong interpersonal skills, high motivation, an optimistic outlook on life, being confident, being intelligent. All these characteristics have been found and have dominated some of the literatures for some time. But overall, there are too many exceptions to support an explanation of leadership purely in terms of personality. So looking at all the studies, it seems that if we would use the Big Five framework, who knows the Big Five framework of personality? Yeah? Some? I think you should all know it from individual differences psychology. Big Five are the Big Five factors are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Together, these 5 factors make the acronym OCEAN. Openness to experience, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And if we look at this Big Five framework and would apply it to all the various characteristics that have been identified in the literature, maybe extraversion would be the one factor that relatively consistently shows up as a factor that makes a good leader or distinguishes good from less good leaders. But there are, again, too many exceptions to the rule to say that we can explain leadership purely in terms of personality. Although other factors have been looked at from this position or this perspective of the great person theory. For example, characteristics such as physical height or weight. And this is an example, the measure of a president in the United States, the last 26, 27 elections. Almost always the taller candidate won the election. So this is Obama versus McCain. This slide is from 2008 when Obama was running for presidency against McCain. Obama was a little bit taller than McCain, and Obama won the election. So this makes 18 out of the 26 most recent elections, and in more than 70% of these elections, the taller candidate won. And also the more heavyweight candidate typically won the elections. My colleague Steffen Giesner has done a lot of research, both experimental and naturalistic field studies, where he shows that when people are photographed from down below or from upside down, so when the angle makes people appear taller or shorter than they really are, this has an impact on how intelligent we rate or evaluate this person, how much status we ascribe to this person, and this makes this person appear a better or a poorer leader. And of course, we cannot stretch ourselves, but what we can do is we can try to look taller than we really are by using high heels. High heels would not be appropriate for political leaders, but as you may all know, Sarkozy always made sure that his wife, who is a little bit taller than he, wore flat shoes where he had relatively high shoes to appear not as short as he would otherwise have appeared, because politicians are very well aware of this fact that height comes with more status. But again, we know of people who were really short and who have made powerful leaders, like Napoleon, as just one example. Okay, so we know that, yes, there are some characteristics that consistently show up, and it certainly does not do any harm to a leader if he or she is intelligent, if they are extrovert, if they are conscientious, and if they are tall. But what is probably more important is, what do leaders actually do? And this has been explored in the 1940s in 2 institutions in the United States, and Michigan State University and at Ohio State University. And you will find both frameworks in the literature. And both frameworks have been intensely studied at 2 different places at the same time, and they both came up with their own labels, but basically it's the same thing. They distinguish between leaders focusing on the task or focusing on the people. And an effective task leader is efficient, directive, and knowledgeable, whereas an effective social leader who is oriented towards the people is friendly, agreeable, concerned with feelings, and socially oriented. Sometimes a group will have a different leader for each of these tasks. Sometimes the same person will serve both roles. But from this behavioral perspective, it is not really clear when is which leadership style more appropriate and when is it less helpful, less effective. And it also is a little bit like the trait theory approach or the great person approach in a way that they typically say one leader is typically either task-oriented or people-oriented, and this is almost like a trait. And it ignores the fact that leaders can switch and can learn and can develop their leadership skills. The next group of theories then was contingency theory. So this group of theories took the situation into account. Is a leader who is very effective, like a task leader, a task leader who is efficient, directive, and knowledgeable, would a leader like this always be effective? Or are there certain situational characteristics that sometimes make a friendly, agreeable, and harmonious-oriented leader more effective? And the most prominent theory in this group of theories is Fred Fiedler's contingency model of leadership effectiveness. This suggests that task-oriented leaders are most effective in high-control and low-control situations. Emotion-focused or people-oriented or socially-oriented leaders are more effective in situations of moderate control. I will show you how control is determined in a moment. Fiedler used an interesting approach, and this he called the LPC scale, the least preferred co-worker scale. Think about the people you have worked with in the past. Think about a team you can imagine that you've been part of in the past. Now think about the one person in that team you least liked, okay? You least preferred working with. Now, Fiedler then presented the leaders a number of adjectives, and he asked the leaders to evaluate this least preferred co-worker. And his reasoning was that if the leader evaluates this least preferred co-worker relatively positively, then this leader must be people-oriented, must be socially oriented, or as Fiedler called it, emotion-focused. If the leader evaluates the least preferred coworker really negatively, then this leader is a task-oriented leader. Okay? So this was a simple and a relatively interesting way of assessing whether a person is task or person-oriented. And then he said, and so now we know if a certain person is more people-oriented, when would that person be the most effective or more effective leader? And he took 3 different factors into account to determine situational control. The first factor was general leader-member relationships. So does the leader and his or her followers get along well with each other? Is there typically a relatively harmonious, positive relationship? Or is it a typically relatively difficult situation where the relations between leaders and followers are not very positive? So he distinguished leader-member relations in good or bad. The second factor is task structure. Is the task really well structured? Is it a clear task that provides information about how to do it, about the processes, about the actions needed to execute the different steps necessary to complete the task? Or is it an unstructured, relatively complex situation that does not in itself tell the people doing the work how they should do it? So the task structure can either be high or low in both of these cases. And the third factor is position power. Does the leader have the power to punish and reward people, fire people, etc.? Can you imagine of a situation where a leader has really, really high power? What would be a typical situation of real high power, high position power, high? The military, perfect example, the military. The military, a military leader, however low in their ranks this leader may be, has relatively high power. Okay? Selbst ein Unteroffizier, der ja noch nicht so richtig ein Leader ist, hat über seine Gruppe von 5 oder 6 einfachen Soldaten absolute Macht, kann befehlen, was er will, wie er will, natürlich mit Einschränkungen, natürlich gibt es Probleme, but this is a position of really high power. Also typically business organizations. The CEO in an organization has relatively high position power over the other people in the executive team. Every member of the executive team has really high position power about the vice presidents or directors, etc. What would be a situation of low power, low position power? Hier die Schüler, haben Sie eine Idee? Low Position Power, was wäre da ein schönes Beispiel dafür? Bitte? Ja, ein Schüler wäre ja kein Leader, aber ein Schülersprecher zum Beispiel. Ein Klassensprecher oder ein Schülersprecher. Ne? Oder denken Sie an Ihre Lehrer, denken Sie an einen Oberstufenkoordinator oder den 3. stellvertretenden Schulleiter oder irgendwie sowas. Das sind appointed leaders that have relatively little power. And it's even worse in the university. When you are a dean of a department, you are an elected leader, but actually, in fact, you have very little power over those you lead, over the other professors. And think about charity organizations, voluntary organizations, where every follower is a voluntary member. So whatever the leader does, the member can decide to quit and never come back, and the leader relies on the people who do voluntary work. So in these situations, people have relatively little position power. Now, if we have 3 factors, general leader-member relations, task structure, and position power, we can combine them to 8 different types. And so here in this 1 and 2, we have generally positive relations, we have a relatively clear task structure, and we have high position power. This would be a situation of very high situational control. In this last example, we have generally poor relationships between leaders and followers, we have a complex, unclear task, and we may have a situation of very low position power. This would be a situation of absolutely low situational control. And we have everything in between, where there's some more or some less situational control. Now, Fiedler predicted, and this is a dotted line based on predictions of Fiedler and some experts. Fiedler asked some experts, what do you think, when is people-oriented or emotion-focused leadership better than task leadership? And this dotted line is a prediction of Fiedler how people-oriented leadership would correlate with group or team performance. And you see that in situations of very low and very high situational control, there's a negative relationship between the LPC score and group performance. That means the higher the people, or the more positive the people completing the LPC scale as a leader evaluate the least preferred coworker, the more people-oriented they lead, and the less good that is for their performance when the situation is very high or very low on situational control. In moderate conditions, there's a positive relationship between the LPC score and group performance. That is, when situations are moderate in situational control, then people-oriented leadership leads to positive results. And the blue line is the results of a meta-analysis of 178 studies. So in the 1960s, after Fiedler developed this framework, a lot of research was done, and Fiedler then combined research of more than 100 studies, and you see that they relatively accurately follow the predicted line. So it seems that people-oriented leadership is good when the task is not very good structured and or position power is low and or the relationships between leader and followers are generally poor. Fiedler argued that in situations of very high situational control, you don't need people orientation. The relationships are good, the task is clear structured anyway, so why would you need pay particular attention to the people? They know what they need to do because the task is clear and they do it happily because they like you as a leader. And so you can focus on the task and you can make the task even clearer by using goal setting and these sorts of things, putting in directives about how to do it better, etc. In situations where you have very poor relationships with your followers and the task is unstructured, then it's also good to focus on the task because people-oriented leadership would make the situation even worse. The task is unclear, so you need to pay attention, or you need to make your people pay attention to how they go about their work. And because you generally have poor relationships to them, if you would start emotion-focused leadership, they would probably not trust you, not believe you, etc. In situations in between, Fiedler predicted orientation towards the people is more important. And as you see, this is what he found. Now, which problems can you imagine arise from this theory? Yes, please.
I think one problem is that there is a hierarchy between the decisions. First, there is the leader-member relation, and maybe the task structure is more important than the leader-member relation, but this is not possible in this theory.
So do you mean, no, do you think that the hierarchy in this slide is wrong, or do you think the theory does not account for possible hierarchies in the real world?
Yes.
Yes. Maybe this is true, yes. I mean, this is just for illustration. You can switch the three factors here and end up with relatively similar patterns. But you are right. In the real world, maybe the task structure is sometimes much more important than the other two factors, and sometimes it's the relations that are more important than the other two factors, and maybe one of these factors alone, when they are important, determine what is necessary, and in other situations it may be the combination of the three. Yes, please.
Isn't also that you could get stuck in the low leader-member relationship because you think it's better to focus on the task instead of improving the relationship?
Okay, so if people would follow Fiedler's advice, and when the relations are generally poor, and you would continue focusing on the task, maybe the relationships would never get better. Okay, there are two other problems. One problem is, like with the trade theory, it's a great person approach. Fiedler typically categorized the people in either being good at people orientation or being good at task orientation. So even this situational contingency theory that takes into account several factors does not allow for a leader to be adaptive to the situation, for a leader to change their behavior. So it's a relatively trade-like theory when we only look at what the leader actually does. And secondly, there are problems with the measurement. If you think about yourself and you would complete a little adjective checklist about the least preferred person you ever worked with, some of you may very clearly negatively evaluate this person. Task orientation. Some of you may be very positive about this person. People orientation. The problem is that in almost all the studies that were conducted, 20 up to 40% of the people who completed the study or the survey fell somewhere in the middle. And for these people, Fiedler cannot say anything about when their behavior would be appropriate and adaptive or not. This is a problem with the LPC scale, and is probably the reason why the LPC scale has not been followed through in modern leadership research. Okay? So it was already a big step from the trait theories to the behavior theories, now to take the situation into account, but it still has its limitations. Now, at about the same time when the Ohio and Michigan State researchers did their investigations, Kurt Lewin did research with some colleagues on leadership styles as well. And you have to understand, in 1939, that was when America was starting to prepare for the fight for the Hitler regime. So Lewin and colleagues probably did their research to demonstrate that the American democratic system was better, rather than to objectively evaluate whether democracy was better than autocracy or dictatorships. So this we have to keep in mind also to understand the wording of this research. But they did a very proper study, and what they did was training young men who helped out as volunteers in children's clubs. So after school play clubs where children of 10 to 12, 13 years got together and played and exercised, etc. And they were organized in little clubs depending on the area they were living in. And Lewin and colleagues trained young 17, 18, 19-year-old men to help out in these clubs as leaders of these little groups of boys and girls. And Lewin trained them in 3 different styles. The autocratic leader took no input from the group members, emphasized their authority, and assigned projects arbitrarily. The democratic leader discussed the activities before assigning them and allowed the children to make their own decisions and encouraged the development of an egalitarian atmosphere in the group. The laissez-faire leader did basically nothing. He rarely intervened in group activities, let the group members work by themselves, did not pay much attention, and did not supervise the teams well. And what Lewin and colleagues did, they trained every person in every of these 3 leadership styles, and then randomly distributed them to the clubs and made them change the clubs so that the leaders went into different clubs and used different leadership styles in different clubs. So they ruled out that it was, by doing this, they ruled out that it was individual characteristics of the leader, because you may have had a leader who was trained autocratic and really did not behave autocratic, or had the physical characteristics of an autocratic leader more than others, etc. So he ruled out that it was individual traits, characteristics of the individual by switching them around through the different clubs, and also that it was individual characteristics of the club in the area, of the boys or whatever, by having different leaders play different roles in the same club. What did they find? They find that there were clear differences in both group satisfaction and performance across the children. So it seems that the leadership style really makes an effect, an impact on the boys' happiness, satisfaction, and their performance. The group with an autocratic leader spent just as much time working on the projects as the children in the democratic groups, but the laissez-faire groups spent less time. So laissez-faire leadership was worse in terms of performance. The children did not spend so much time on their project. When the leader left the room, work in the autocratic group dropped off. But it stayed the same in the democratic groups, and it even increased in the laissez-faire groups. So this was the answer to the focus question at the beginning, and you got them all right. So if Jane, who typically is autocratic, leaves the office, then performance would go down because people would spend less effort on their tasks. It appears that the democratic leaders were able to produce a type of acceptance of the rules and norms. So even when the democratic leader leaves the room, the children still pay attention to their projects because they have internalized that the project is a good one and that continue working on them would be good. Whereas in the authoritarian leaders, they produced only compliance. Think about the sessions we had on social influence. So the majority influence typically leads to compliance, whereas minority influence leads to internalization of group norms. The children who worked under autocratic leaders showed also more reliance on the leader, complained more, and made more demands for attention by the leader. Okay? So the results were very clear, and since 1939 we know autocratic leadership is bad because it makes people less happy and less productive whenever the leader is not around. And democratic leadership is much better. Okay? Ob das wirklich immer und überall so ist, ist die Frage. Aber es wird immer noch gerne genommen, um im Irak oder Afghanistan oder sonst wo einzumarschieren, wenn immer man denkt, dass das eigene Gesellschaftsmodell das Bessere sei. Und es ist vielleicht auch oft besser. Aber deswegen habe ich das am Anfang gesagt, man muss im Hinterkopf behalten, dass Levin diese Forschung zu einer ganz bestimmten Zeit gemacht hat und dass die Forscher vielleicht nicht ganz so neutral waren und nicht ganz so objektiv ihre Hypothesen wirklich offen getestet haben, sondern eine bestimmte Intention auch damit hatten. Ja, bitte.
Wurde nicht Levin dafür kritisiert, dass dieser demokratische Leader kein demokratischer Anführer war, sondern auch Vorgaben hatte und den Kindern sozusagen einen Entscheidungsfreiraum gegeben hat, aber trotzdem Grenzen festgelegt hat? Also es war keine reale Demokratie, wie Levin es hätte eigentlich machen sollen.
Genau, also die Leader wurden ja nicht von den Kindern gewählt, so wie wir das in einem demokratischen System haben, sondern der demokratische Leader war sozusagen ein bisschen auch autokratisch. Nur der autokratische wiederum, der hatte vielleicht auch direkt Züge von negativer Führung und deswegen hat es auch vielleicht einige der negativen Ergebnisse gegeben. Ich persönlich glaube ja daran, dass es gut ist, Menschen zu vertrauen und dass man Menschen interessante Projekte geben muss und dass man Menschen auch beteiligen muss. Partizipation, hat sich herausgestellt, ist in der Regel ein gutes Instrument, um Mitarbeiter auch mehr zufrieden zu machen und sie auch mehr an die Entscheidungen, an denen sie selber beteiligt sind, zu binden, weil sie dann eben die Aufgaben auch mehr aus sich heraus machen. Und George Akerlof, der Nobelpreisträger in der Ökonomie von 2001, glaube ich, der hat in den letzten Jahren unter dem Stichwort Identity Economics auch in prominenten Ökonomiejournalen immer wieder geschrieben, Vertrauen ist besser als Kontrolle, weil Kontrolle kostet erstens viel Geld und zweitens signalisiert es Misstrauen und alles andere konstant gehalten, ist es kostenintensiver, diese Kontrolle immer aufrechtzuerhalten und gegen das Misstrauen dann auch noch andere Maßnahmen durchzuführen, als per se mehr zu vertrauen und eine gemeinsame Identität herzustellen. Ja, bitte.
Ja, aber Kontrolle hat ja zwei Gesichter. Ich muss ja präsent sein, um kontrollieren zu können. Und wenn ich also damit verbinde, dass ich kontrolliere, habe ich verloren. Aber ich kann ja auch einfach Interesse zeigen. Und damit schließe ich ja nicht aus, dass ich die Kontrolle habe. Also ich kann das so jetzt einfach stehen lassen.
Ja, danke. Also die Frage, ich soll die Fragen wiederholen, stand in der Lehrevaluation, weil das sonst nicht so auf der Kamera ist. Also die Frage ist, ob Kontrolle immer dieses negative Gesicht von Kontrollieren haben muss oder ob Kontrolle, wenn man da ist und Interesse zeigt für das, was die Mitarbeiter tun, das nicht auch positive Auswirkungen haben kann. Und dem stimme ich hundertprozentig zu. Aber wenn wir uns anschauen, was in großen Unternehmen teilweise tatsächlich passiert, also was für ein irrer bürokratischer Aufwand teilweise getrieben wird, um Spesenabrechnungen von Mitarbeitern zu kontrollieren, wo es um ein paar Euro letztendlich geht und wo viel Personal sozusagen nur damit beschäftigt ist, alles immer noch mal nachzurechnen. Oder wo wir sehen, dass Unternehmen wie Schlecker oder Lidl Überwachungskameras installieren, nicht um Ladendiebstahl zu verhindern, sondern um zu verhindern, dass die Mitarbeiter mal eine Pause machen, wo sie vielleicht nötig haben. Das ist eben die Kontrolle, die ich meine oder die Akerlof meint. Okay. Finally, leadership is a group process. We cannot see the leader as isolated from the follower. A leader leads a group of people. So leadership always also is a process within and of groups. And it is affected by the leader-member relations, as we have already seen in Fiedler's model, but also the extent to which members and the leader identify with the group and are prototypical of the group or not. This is one example of a study by Mike Hock. They have made the leader, they have brought participants into the laboratory, randomly elected one person as a leader, and had them work on a certain task. And they either describe this randomly elected leader as very prototypical for the group or as less prototypical for the group. So imagine you would come into the social psychology laboratory in the Kettenhofweg in a group of 4 people, and I would select one of you as a leader, and then you would do a little test or whatever, and then I would give you and the group some feedback that the person selected a leader is deviating from the group's average opinion on some student-related issue, or that the leader elected is the only one who is studying a different subject besides psychology in a group of all psychology students. So this makes the leader looking less prototypical or more prototypical if I describe the same person as fitting the group's average stereotype, represents the group well. The other factor was that the group was made more or less salient by simply telling these 3 or 4 people, okay, you are a bunch of individuals, come into the lab, we do a little test, and then you can all go home again. Or you tell them, okay, you are a bunch of individuals, for the next half an hour in this experiment, I expect you to act as a group, because we test you as a group, and one of you will be the leader of the group. So the groupiness was made more or less important. And as you can see, when the group is not very salient, then the non-prototypical leader is even a little bit more perceived as being a little bit more effective. So in a collection of individuals, the one who does not represent the group's average may be seen as even more effective, whereas when the group context makes the group salient, then the prototypical leader is more effective than the less prototypical leader. And this is highly significant. And there are now some, I would think, 10 or more studies that have confirmed this effect. Oliver Christ, Johannes Ulrich und ich haben vor 3 Jahren eine Studie publiziert. Da haben wir Studenten der Uni Marburg befragt. Und zwar haben wir alle Studenten im 1. oder 2. Semester im Hörsaal gefragt, wen sie am Sonntag wählen würden. Und dann haben, was auch zu erwarten ist, eine ganze Reihe gesagt, ich würde die Grünen wählen. Und mit denen haben wir dann weitergearbeitet. Mit den anderen haben wir gesagt, brauchen wir nicht. Und wir haben denen einen Leader beschrieben, weiß nicht, das heißt bei den Grünen nicht so, aber so eine Art Ortsgruppenleiter oder sowas. Und haben den beschrieben als sehr typisch für die Grünen. Der hat Soziologie studiert und leitet heute so ein semi-autonomes Kulturzentrum und macht da irgendwie Veranstaltungen. Oder wir haben ihn beschrieben als nicht prototypisch für die Grünen. Selbes Alter, selbes Geschlecht, selber was weiß ich. Nur wir haben gesagt, der hat BWL studiert und ist Geschäftsführer in einem kleinen Unternehmen. Das ist für die Grünen weniger typisch als der Soziologe, der sich irgendwie für alternative Kultur interessiert. Dann haben wir gesagt, so, und dieser Leader, der musste jetzt irgendwie eine Entscheidung treffen über irgendwie, weiß ich nicht, eine Windkraftanlage oder so. Also auch irgendwie ein Thema, was für die Grünen relevant war. Und wir haben gesagt, in der einen Bedingung, Der Leader hat vorher eine Mitgliederbefragung gemacht, hat die Leute zusammengeholt, hat ihnen Voice gegeben, so haben wir das operationalisiert, also hat sie beteiligt an der Entscheidung. In der anderen Bedingung hat er das nicht gemacht, sondern hat die Entscheidung einfach selber getroffen. Was wir gefunden haben war, unter den Studenten, die grünen Sympathisanten sind und sie wählen würden, unterscheiden sich nochmal die beiden Gruppen, nämlich diejenigen, die sich sehr stark identifizieren und diejenigen, die sich nicht so stark identifizieren. Für diejenigen, die sich nicht so stark identifizieren mit den Grünen, das ist sozusagen diese Bedingung, war die Prototypikalität des Leaders weniger wichtig als die Tatsache, ob er sie an Entscheidungen beteiligt oder nicht. Die Leader, die wir beschrieben haben, die an Entscheidungen beteiligt haben, wurden als besser und effektiver gesehen und man hat gesagt, die würde ich mehr unterstützen, als die Leader, die weniger an Entscheidungen beteiligt haben, unabhängig davon, wie prototypisch sie waren. In der Gruppe aber von den hochidentifizierten grünen Sympathisanten war es umgekehrt. Dort war es Prototypikalität wichtiger als die Frage, ob sie Partizipation und Voice gegeben haben oder nicht. Das heißt, in einer Gruppe, in der sich alle hochidentifizieren, ist es für eine Führungskraft wichtig, auch prototypisch für diese Gruppe zu sein. Dann kann sich diese Führungskraft manchmal auch Dinge erlauben, die man sonst vielleicht weniger tolerieren würde. Das kann man jetzt positiv oder negativ sehen, manchmal ist das vielleicht sinnvoll, manchmal ist das nötig, manchmal hat eben ein Leader von seiner Prototypikalität her den Vorteil, dass er Dinge auch schnell durchsetzen kann, weil seine Untergebenen oder seine Mitarbeiter ihm schneller verzeihen und ihn sowieso sozusagen als guten Leader, gute Führungskraft akzeptieren. Sie können sich aber schnell vorstellen, dass das schnell auch sozusagen in so eine dunkle Seite reingehen kann und zu negativem Verhalten führt. Okay, so there are many studies that show leadership is a group process. It's not only about the leader's characteristics, their behavior, the situational control, etc. It's the leader in the group context and as a member of a group. Now, we have also done some studies where we show that leader identification is an important variable. We have done this research in German schools, in the German travel industry, in the United States, in the pharmaceutical industry. I've done some studies in Great Britain. We have done studies in the field and in the laboratory. And what we consistently find is when leaders identify more with their organization, this spills over to their followers and they also identify more. And this leads to more follower satisfaction and performance. We have found in the travel industry, for example, that across 3 different levels of hierarchy, when the regional directors are more identified with the travel organization, the company, the managers in the travel agencies identify more strongly. And when the managers in the travel agencies identify more strongly, the sales agents you have contact to when you go into a travel agency and book a journey or a flight are more identified. And this leads them to be more effective. So what we've done, for example, in one study, it's not on this slide, in one study with Jan Wieseke, we have sent mystery shoppers in the travel agencies. So students who went into 60 different travel agencies went there and asked for standardized service. Like, okay, next summer I'm thinking about going to Spain. Can you give me some recommendations for hotels? And as soon as they left the travel agency, they rated the travel agent's friendliness, the quality of the service, etc. And what we found was that when the leaders were more identified, this leads to the customers at the end happiness and satisfaction mediated through customer contact employees identification. So the leader can really make a difference. Now, from all these studies, you can easily ask, yeah, but can it not also go the other way around? So when a leader is newly elected or appointed, might it not be the case that follower identification influences leader identification? Yes, that might be the case. We control for all sorts of things, but these types of studies cannot rule out reverse causality. So what we've done is we went into the laboratory and we did several experiments in the X-Pass here in Frankfurt. And in one of these studies, we brought 34 first semesters into the laboratory, and we manipulated perceived leader identification. So they came into the laboratory in groups of 3, and one of them was a Confederate, so it was one of us. And then they had to build little towers of Lego bricks. And we told them as a cover story, we are interested in whether it makes a difference what color the Lego bricks are. And psychology students in the first semester almost believe everything. So they thought, yes, it might be about the color of the Lego bricks or whatever they thought, but they didn't find the true objectives of the study, that we were interested in whether it makes a difference whether the leader presents him or herself as strongly identified with the group or not. In the low identified condition, the leader made some remarks during the teamwork saying that you will make it or you are good. In the high identified condition, the leader said, we will make it and we are good. Okay? So we manipulated the leader's alleged identification with a small team. And this is a manipulation check, and you see that it has had a strong effect. Then we asked participants about their own group identification. So how strongly did you identify with this group of 3 people now? And you see that in the low leader identification manipulation, people identified a little bit less than in the high leader identification manipulation. You see that the effect is not really strong. It's like 0.6 or 7 difference, but it's highly significant. And now we were interested in whether this had an effect on people's performance. So we simply told them, use as many Lego bricks as you can. You have like 3 minutes, and build little towers of Lego bricks of 20 bricks, and then put them aside and build the next tower. And the leader's job is to take the time and to put the towers together, to assemble them together at the end and make a really big tower out of them. We were interested in whether the manipulation had an effect on people's performance. We had them work on the task twice. First as a baseline, then we changed the color, and then we had them work on the task again. And in between, we manipulated the leader's identification by having the leader make the positive group-related statement or the positive individual-directed statements. And this is the result. So when we control for the baseline in the first trial, we find a marginally significant difference of some 8 or 9 Lego bricks difference. So that means this small manipulation, the leader saying you instead of we, already makes a difference in the team members' performance. We also did mediation analyses, and we found that the difference here, this marginally significant difference here, goes back to the slightly stronger identification of the team members. So this is an arbitrary experiment, had nothing to do with travel agents' performance or school teachers' behavior in the classroom. But it is proof of causality, because we randomly assigned the participants to the 2 groups, and nothing else than the small difference in the alleged leader's behavior can cause these differences. Okay? And these experiments are necessary. In this paper with Sebastian Schuh, we combine 2 of these experiments, and it is necessary to extend field research by laboratory research like this to really prove causality, because now we can go to organizations and tell them, because we know that this is true in the field, and we know that it is causally affected by the leader's identification, it is worthwhile to paying attention to your leader's identification, which organizations often ignore. Leaders at the very top are typically elected or selected from the outside, and the Aufsichtsrat in the big organizations don't care about any previous relationships, etc. And the leaders in the middle management are often the ones that are the worst off in organizations because they get pressure from both sides and they find it sometimes very difficult to identify strongly. Okay, finally, the most recent theory in leadership research is the differentiation between transactional and transformational leadership. Transactional are the leaders who provide the way to the goal and reward people who achieve the goal and punish people who don't achieve the goal. Transformational leaders are more charismatic, they have a vision where the group is going, they attempt to stimulate and inspire their followers to move beyond the present status and to create a new and better future. So transactional leadership is not bad, but there are some situations where we need more than just transactions. You do X, I pay you Y. If you don't do X, I penalize or punish you. In some situations, in modern times, when there's a lot of change going on, we need transformational leaders who have a vision and who can inspire their followers to contribute to achieving this vision. Und jetzt zeige ich Ihnen zwei kleine Ausschnitte von einem ganz alten Film, 1955 oder so, mit Gregory Peck, Moby Dick. Moby Dick, hat das jemand schon mal gesehen? Ja, ein paar, aber gehört haben alle schon davon. Sie wissen, dass Moby Dick das Synonym war für die RAF, für die Bundesrepublik Deutschland, für den Schweinestaat, den man unbedingt umbringen musste. Und die erste Generation der RAF hat sich Tarnnamen aus Melvilles Roman gegeben. Also die waren dann Captain Ahab und so weiter. Und das ist wirklich ein wirklich gutes Buch. Sie müssen Melville mal lesen, wenn es geht, im Original. Sie werden gleich vielleicht nicht alles verstehen, weil die Sprache sehr altmodisch auch ist. Aber ich werde Ihnen erst einen Ausschnitt zeigen, in dem Captain Ahab transaktional führt. Er hat demjenigen, der den weißen Wal zuerst sieht, eine Goldmünze versprochen. Die hat er dann an den Mast genagelt, nimmt die ab und gibt die dem. Und dann verspricht er ihnen noch mehr. Es geht also um Transaktion. Das ist transaktionale Führung. Er sagt, hier ist die Goldmünze, so, und der Nächste, der kriegt auch noch was. Und dann verteile ich auch, wenn wir den Wal fangen und töten, verteile ich auch noch 10% des Profits, der mir zusteht. Und dann sind die erstmal da und können das noch gar nicht so richtig glauben. Und erst als der Vorarbeiter, ich weiß nicht, wie man den auf einem Schiff nennt, sagt, hurra, dann geht's los. Und das Ganze braucht eben ein bisschen mehr. Die Situation ist sehr unsicher, die wissen eigentlich gar nicht, warum sie noch da sind. Die sind wochenlang oder monatelang auf dem Meer unterwegs gewesen, der Wal zeigt sich nicht und sie haben da auch Gerüchte gehört, dass das nicht so ein nettes Tierchen ist, was man so einfach fangen kann. Und jetzt kommt die andere Szene, in der Captain Ahab auf fast religiöse Weise sozusagen diese Seeleute auf diese gemeinsame Vision einschwört. Sie werden sehen, dass diese Zeremonie, die er da macht, das erinnert an so ein Abendmahl in der Kirche. Und schauen Sie in die leuchtenden Augen der Mannschaft.
Captain Ahab. Stoke up the try-works. We shall run forward laden with fire, to render the white whale's flesh into unholy oil. Blacksmith, I set ye a task. Take these harpoons and lances, melt them down, forge me new weapons that will strike deep and hold fast, but do not douse them in water. They must have a proper baptism. What say ye, all ye men? Will you give as much blood as shall be needed to temper the steel? My anchor, now add your own. Be the cogs that fit my wheel, the gunpowder that takes my torch. Pledge yourselves, heart, soul, body, life and lungs, as I pledge myself. Death to Moby Dick.
Also ich finde, das ist eine sehr schöne Szene, in der man wirklich sieht, worum es geht bei transformationaler Führung. Man muss charismatisch sein, man muss mit Metaphern arbeiten, man muss die Leute wirklich einschwören auf eine Vision. Ich würde jetzt, wenn ich Herr Fitschen in der Deutschen Bank wäre, nicht unbedingt mit Blut und so weiter arbeiten. Aber gerade in diesen unsicheren Zeiten ist es eben wichtig, dass jemand sagt, worum geht es und was wollen wir erreichen und wie kommen wir durch diese schwierigen Zeiten durch. Und wir müssen alle zusammenhalten und uns anstrengen. Da reicht es nicht mehr, wenn man sagt, ja, ihr kriegt eure Boni weiter oder ich verspreche euch, dass wenn ihr Überstunden macht, werden wir euch das irgendwann entgelten. Und vielleicht vergessen Sie in ein paar Wochen schon wieder alles, was Sie heute gehört haben, aber vielleicht erinnern Sie sich an Moby Dick. Yeah. Okay. I would like to spend the rest of this session on group decision making, which is also a very important topic in social psychology. Group decisions can sometimes be predicted accurately by the pre-discussion distribution of opinions in the group. So if there's pre-discussion, a distribution of opinions, then the group discusses and then the group reaches an agreement or a group position that can sometimes be predicted by the individual distribution of the opinions and from the decision-making rule that prevails in the group at that time. We have already talked about brainstorming. I think when we talked about social loafing, I mentioned that there are hundreds of studies that show that sometimes or often groups are less effective in brainstorming than individuals. And part of the reason is because of distorted perceptions. So people think they were more effective in groups, although this is not actually true, and I will show you why on the next slide, but also on the enjoyment of working in groups. People typically like working with others rather than sitting alone in their little offices. So, and this causes some feeling or illusion of group effectivity that actually is not true. And this is one of the reasons. People seem to have distorted perceptions. So here we have the typical nominal group, 3 people who are sitting individually and generate idea to a certain topic, and here the 3 people do it together in a real group. And what you see is that more often in the real group than in the nominal group, people think that they had the same idea but just did not mention it. So when you are with others and others raise ideas and you contribute to it, afterwards you have the feeling that you yourself had all the ideas. This is part of the problem that leads us to the perception that, oh, it's much more effective in a group, whereas in fact it is not. And we have talked about channeling and frame of reference and social loafing, which led me to the conclusion that if you do brainstorming because you have to solve a complicated, difficult problem, have the people first individually think about ideas and then get together in a group where they can raise and talk about their ideas. Groups, and particularly established groups that have a transactive memory structure, are often more effective than individuals at remembering information. So even in our department, a relatively established group with Johannes and Sebastian and Alina and my secretary and several Hilfskräfte, several Hiwis, this is an established group that is together for quite some time, 6-7 years, and we each have our specific areas where we focus on and where we have specific memory of. The secretary knows more about the budget than everyone else. I probably know a little bit more about research than some people of the group. Some of my PhD students know more about their certain aspects. And this makes us develop what is called a transactive memory system. So we have memory as a group that is more than the sum of the individuals. One problem in group decision making is group think, and you've probably heard about it. It was researched by Erwin Janis in the 1960s, and in 1982 he published an influential book about it, and he analyzed the catastrophic decision-making of the Kennedy administration to invade the Bay of Pigs on Cuba. So the military at that time thought that Cuba was easy to overturn, and the plan was to get some exiled Cubans into Cuba who would then ask the United States for help to intervene. And almost all the soldiers were captured or killed, and the plan was a big catastrophe for the United States and a big blamage for the United States. And Janis analyzed the different steps that led to this faulty decision making, and he called it groupthink. And this is basically that when the group is highly cohesive, so Kennedy had a close circle of advisors, military advisors and political advisors with him when they made the decision, a highly cohesive group. Closed to outside opinions. There were no outsiders present when this was discussed, and this is probably the case whenever a military decision is discussed and taken. There are no outsiders that provide outside views. It's always insiders, the inner circle of any country's power. It has a strong and directive leader. Of course, Kennedy was a strong and respected leader. The group does not have systematic procedures to evaluate alternative, and it feels high stress or external threat. All of this was true at that time. So this leads the group to have a strong desire for consensus. Consensus seems more important than spending a little more time and discussing additional alternatives and maybe have a vote on it that may not be 100% consensual. Characteristics of the group are that the group feels invulnerable, assumes that its position is moral, has an illusion of unanimity because no one is criticizing what the leader says. Everyone assumes that everyone else thinks like the leader. And the consequences are poor decision making. And this has been found relatively often, and a more recent, although now more than 25 years ago, was the catastrophe of Chernobyl. Und da gibt es ein sehr schönes Paper dazu, das finden Sie bei uns auf der Homepage unter Materialien im Archiv. Ich Ich habe jetzt leider die Namen vergessen. Es sind zwei Autoren, die haben hierüber ein Paper in der Zeitschrift Umweltpsychologie publiziert auf Deutsch. Und die haben analysiert, wie es zu dieser Katastrophe von Tschernobyl kommen konnte. Und ganz viele Aspekte von Groupthink spielen da eine Rolle. Das waren Ingenieure in der Ukraine, die damals sich als Elite des Staates verstanden haben, die auch immer wieder rückgemeldet bekommen haben, ihr seid wirklich die Elite, die wir haben an Ingenieuren, ihr leitet hier so ein Megaprojekt, was irgendwie die Zukunft der Energieversorgung für immer sicherstellen wird. Sie sollten dann so einen Sicherheitstest machen und verschiedene andere Faktoren führten dann dazu, dass dieser Sicherheitstest relativ schnell außer Kontrolle geriet und dann spielten diese Groupthink-Faktoren eine ganz große Rolle. Es gab keine Outsider, die irgendwie gesagt haben, naja, wir könnten es auch anders machen oder die gewarnt haben. Man fühlte sich als sehr cohesive, war unter großem Stress, fühlte, dass irgendwie alle das Gleiche dachten. Es war eine klare Leadership-Struktur, eine Hierarchie da und die führte dann dazu, dass an 2 oder 3 Stellen einfach die falschen Entscheidungen getroffen wurden. Den Ausgang kennen Sie. Also Groupthink is one important phenomenon that can help explain real-world phenomena and catastrophes. How can we overcome groupthink? The most important thing seems to be that the leader stays impartial as long as possible. When a strong and respected leader like Kennedy or the chief engineer in Chernobyl early on raise their preferences or announce their preferences, then this seems to be part of the problem of groupthink in the first place. And when the leader stays impartial and encourages the expression of dissent among group members, then this can help overturn groupthink. You will also find these 3 advice in the literature, but I put exclamation marks behind them because I'm not sure whether they would really work. Consult outside experts, appoint a devil's advocate, or split the group in several subcommittees. These can all contribute to more positive outcomes because there may be more dissenting opinions that are evaluated, but it can also lead to more cohesion and to more identification. So when the outside expert or the devil's advocates are appointed, this can lead the others to feel more like an in-group and point at the devil's advocate at the out-group, and they will probably even listen to his or her voice and opinion less than they would otherwise do. So these 3 things are to be taken with a little bit caution. The first thing is very important. One problem or one aspect of this, and that the leader needs to stay impartial, is that groups tend to discuss shared rather than unshared information. So when the leader announces their preference early on, the group members share what they already know positively about this alternative or this preference, and they do not share information that the other team members would not have. So they use these meetings to confirm rather than challenge initial beliefs. And therefore, while the group may have the potential to make better decisions than individuals, often they do not. And this has been found by Felix Brubeck, now at the University of Munich, Steffen Schulz-Hart at the University of Göttingen, and they used a paradigm that is called the hidden profile. It's a relatively simple technique. You are asked to select, say, a pilot for Lufthansa. And you are given 3 different candidates. And for each candidate, you will receive some positive and some negative information. And you first get your information individually, and then you are asked to get together as a group to discuss the pros and cons of every candidate and make a choice. The hidden profile is set up in a way that these are the candidates, A or B, and these are the 3 team members, X, Y, Z. Now, and this is only the positive information to make it simpler. For candidate A, group member X has 2 pieces of positive information and 3 pieces of positive information for candidate B. So individually, group member X should decide for candidate B because there are simply more positive options. Same is true for group member Y and group member Z. Each time 2 pieces of positive information for A, 3 positive information for B, so they should all go for candidate B. When you screen the information and you read the characteristics or descriptions, you will form a preference. Everyone is doing that. So your preference, your default, when you go into the group discussion, is appointing candidate B. And what is done in the group discussion is that these pieces of information that are shared by all members will be talked about a lot. Whereas, and this is a trick, and this is called why it's a hidden profile, there are 3 pieces of information that are not shared among all group members, but that only individual group members hold. And this is the whole idea of having different people coming together making different decisions, that they have maybe different perspectives, or that they have different backgrounds that lead them to evaluate some information differently, or whatever. So it does not make sense to make a decision in a group of 3 when everyone would have the same information anyway. Then just one person could make the decision, okay? But the problem is that these pieces of unshared information that would normally lead to a decision in favor of candidate A because there's one piece more of positive information than for candidate B, these pieces of unshared information are not discussed in the group decision-making process. Brodbeck, Schulz-Hart und so weiter haben hunderte von Studien dazu gemacht, viele, viele Studien, verschiedene Kontexte mit Studenten, mit Managern und so weiter. Wenn man einem Individuum alle Kandidaten gibt, machen die immer die richtige Entscheidung. Also es ist natürlich viel komplizierter als hier. Normalerweise hat man für jeden Kandidaten so 8 oder 9 Informationsteile. Manche sind positiv, manche sind negativ. Es ist nicht so ganz so einfach zu durchschauen, wie Sie jetzt, wenn Sie auf diese Folie gucken. Aber wenn man Individuen diese 3 Kandidaten gibt, oder 4 Kandidaten, dann machen die immer die richtige Entscheidung. Gibt man die Informationen so verteilt, wie ich das hier skizziert habe, 3 oder 4 Gruppenmitgliedern, treffen sie fast nie die richtige Entscheidung. Es kommt fast nicht vor, dass Gruppen sozusagen merken, dass für einen Kandidaten, den man erst gar nicht auf dem Radar hat, doch viel sprechen würde, weil die ungeteilten Informationen gar nicht zur Sprache kommen. Man hört von dem anderen, oh ja, ich würde B nehmen, weil ich habe da was, und dann sagt jemand, oh, habe ich auch, und außerdem habe ich für B noch das, und dann sagt der dritte, ja, habe ich auch, und man äußert das gar nicht, was individuell für Kandidat A sprechen würde. Das findet man ganz oft. Was Brodbeck und Kollegen dann versucht haben, ist zu schauen, wie können wir das abstellen, wie können wir das reduzieren. Und es scheint so zu sein, man kann nicht einfach Leuten sagen, ihr sollt keine Präferenz bilden. Das funktioniert nicht. Man bildet diese Präferenz automatisch und dann agiert man auch danach. Das Einzige, was zu funktionieren scheint, ist, dass man der Gruppe sagt, eure Aufgabe ist nicht, die Entscheidung zu treffen. Eure Aufgabe ist, alle Informationen, die ihr habt, auszutauschen, darzustellen, ein bisschen zu ordnen und zu strukturieren, sodass dann eine andere Person die Entscheidung treffen kann. Typischerweise natürlich der Chef. Okay? Think the final point, group polarization. Groups that already tend towards an extreme position on one topic of discussion make even more extreme decisions than the average of the members' initial positions would suggest. Okay? So if I would ask you for your opinion on, what can we take, if you were Americans, US Americans, and I would today ask you about gun possession. Should we have more control and more laws against individuals, private people possessing guns or not? We will talk about this in the next session on aggression a little more. Then you know from the discussion over the last 2 or 3 days that there is some discussion in America and that there's no unequivocal thinking about, yes, now should be the time when guns should be completely forbidden. quite the opposite. There are some people who say, no, 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 we need more guns. The teachers should have had really good weapons to be prepared for the killer. And other people, of course, say the opposite. But now, if you have a group of people who have a certain opinion that is already a little bit extreme in the one or the other direction, then you have these people discuss, and then you ask them for the opinion again. Then the opinion would shift into the more extreme decisions, more extreme direction. Why is this the case? First, because of persuasive argument theory. When the group discusses, then the individuals may have one or the other argument why they have their position, and this brings everyone, say, on the same level. Secondly, self-presentation theory. So if the group already thinks in one way, there's individuals, we want to top it. We want to make a statement that, yes, we think that also, but a little bit more extreme than you. And social identity theory suggests that group members try to conform to the group and perceive the group norm as more extreme as it maybe really is. So group polarization is a big problem that occurs in groups that are already tending towards a certain direction. When the groups are completely evenly split, when it's 5-5 or 4 votes against 4, then they compromise rather than polarize. But this is not very often the case, because we typically are around others who are likewise, and they may already have an opinion in one or the other direction, and then this opinion gets more extreme during the discussion. And if you add the hidden profile experiments to that, and if you add the groupthink phenomenon to it, then you see that often groups can make much, much poorer decisions than individuals. Maybe over the Christmas you will have some time to watch one or the other of these videos, and I particularly like this film in the old version with Henry Fonda. And here you see all the elements of group decision making, polarization, groupthink, leadership, etc. It's a wonderful movie, and it's really worthwhile looking at it, and I think a used version on Amazon is 97 cents or so. So please, over the next 2 weeks, think about watching some social psychology in the real world. Ich wünsche Ihnen ein frohes Fest und einen guten Start ins nächste Jahr, und wir sehen uns dann wieder Mitte Januar zu einer Sitzung über Aggression. Dankeschön.